The next thing that I'm going to get into is the tests that a healthcare provider would order to try to figure out your dosages of both the indirect thrombin inhibitors like heparin and your vitamin K antagonist. So one, I think, clever picture that I found is a way to remember what tests you'd give. So they recommend that you hold up your 2 hands and your 10 fingers, and remember that heparin has 7 letters. So to use up the remaining 3 fingers, you can use the test PTT, partial thromboplastin time. That is the test that you're going to use for heparin, your heparin levels. We tend to speed things up in laboratories by adding some thickeners. And so if it is speeded up, it's called an activated PTT or an APTT. On the other hand, Coumadin has 8 letters. And so if you want to make up your other 2 fingers, you can remember PT, prothrombin time. And that is one of the tests that you use to test your heparin level or your Coumadin levels. And that is always paired with a test called the INR, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the little cartoon on the bottom says, wow, this is a good way to remember which lab goes with which medication. So just remember to look at your fingers, 7 for heparin plus PTT, 8 for Coumadin plus PT. And that at least kind of gives you a little bit of a start. So let's talk about these tests. These test for the effectiveness of the anticoagulant. Once again, I'm trying to balance my phone on a stack of books, so I will try to show you the whole slide, but I might have to adjust it a little. For Coumadin, we use PT or the prothrombin time. Now, the prothrombin time is a blood test that measures how long it takes blood to form a soft clot in a tube. It doesn't take very long. Remember that blood that is interrupted in its circulation is blood that is going to clot. And so it only takes an average of 11 to 13 seconds for that blood to start firming up in a tube that doesn't have any additives. Now, I got this information from WebMD, and depending on the lab, it might be slightly different. But this particular information was off the WebMD site, and you can find all kinds of info about PT, INR, and just make sure that you know the difference between the 2 tests. So according to WebMD, it takes approximately 11 to 13 seconds to start firming up, but that clot's still going to be soft. Now, the PT is going to be paired with a test called the INR, that is the International Normalized Ratio. That is a mathematical equation that was invented by scientists to give the level in the blood just a flat number. When we're talking about PT or prothrombin time, time is the operative word here, and it tells us that we're measuring things in seconds. Whereas an INR is just a straight number. And you take the result of the PT, 11 seconds, 12 seconds, whatever, and you apply this mathematical formula, and it gives you an INR. And most of the time in a clinical setting, you're going to see PT and INR listed together. So you'll have a certain number of seconds for your PT, and it'll just give you a straight number. The average INR in a patient who is not taking warfarin or a similar drug is about 0.8 to 1.1. Remember, just a straight number. When we have somebody on warfarin, we want that number to be somewhat higher, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Now, the test for heparin is the PTT, the partial thromboplastin time. Once again, it's a time, so we're going to be measuring it in seconds. This is the most commonly used test, but To speed things up, the lab will have an additive in the tube to make the clotting faster. That cuts in half the clotting time. And they'll use something like kaolin or another thickener. Anybody who makes jam or jelly knows that you have to add a thickener, or else you're just going to pour the fruit mixture out on your toast rather than being able to spread it. So kaolin is sometimes a thickener that'll be added, or pectin, and it just takes a liquid and firms it up a little, sort of like the thickened liquids that we give our patients if they can't swallow things well. So this is similar. When there's an additive put in the tube to speed up the thickening, then it becomes an activated PTT, or a PTT. So you'll see a small a and then a PTT. According to WebMD, the average PTT in an unmedicated person is about 60 to 70 seconds, so about a minute. And that means that if you draw the blood up in a tube and it doesn't have an additive of some type, but you've just got that blood sitting there, it's going to start clotting fairly quickly, but it's going to form a firmer clot. And if you were to shake that tube back and forth at about a minute, you'd start hearing like a little thump because that blood is forming a thicker clot. By activating it or adding a thickener to that tube, you can cut that time about in half. So a PTT in an unmedicated person would be about 60 to 70 seconds. An activated PTT would be about 30 to 40 seconds. So it would drop it from maybe about a minute to form a firm clot to a half a minute. Now, when you're figuring out how much IV heparin to give a person, it's weight-based. So you're going to figure out somebody's weight in kilograms, and then you're going to give them a certain amount of kilograms or units per kilogram. Generally, with IV, they will start with a bolus dose, a larger dose, and then once the activated PTT gets within a certain level, then they'll drop it down to a maintenance dose, which is lower. The coag time, or bleeding time, is usually going to be monitored an average of every 4 hours for somebody who's on IV heparin. And you'll hear them referred to coagulation time as clotting time. And like we said, activated PTT, or regular PTT, is usually 60 to 70 seconds. Now, what we're looking for is that clotting time to be lengthened. We don't want the blood to clot as quickly as it ordinarily would. In an unmedicated person, you've got about a minute for something to clot. If you're on medication, you expect that something is going to clot over a longer period of time. And luckily, that period of time is equal for both PT and activated PTT, in that you want the time it takes to clot to be about 1.5 to 2.5 times normal. So showing an example, let's say that someone has comes in and they're unmedicated, and you check their PT, and it takes 12 seconds for that blood to form a soft clot in the tube. This is a person who is unmedicated. So what you're looking for once a person starts